we've been studying really two groups of squirrel monkeys for over a decade, so not continuously. And so I'm at Cal Lutheran, and I also have an appointment at a university in Brazil, so I have some grad students from there and undergrads from Cal Lutheran, which has been really nice. So I'm actually going to start with my acknowledgements because I'm going to talk about a lot of different types of data, and all of these people contributed to the data. So we have students, the assistants in the field, and several colleagues in the States and in Brazil. So I couldn't, this is not all done by myself. So, okay, so I'm going to start off talking about some of my earlier work, focusing on juvenile squirrel monkeys and specifically on their feeding ecology. And then this is really a trajectory through time, basically. So how I started and sort of where we are now. Then talk about male squirrel monkeys, moving on a little bit to female squirrel monkeys. And then I'm going to end with something fun, which is the latest thing we've been doing is trying to trap the squirrel monkeys, which is aptly named an adventure because it's not very easy. So life history theory says that organisms are going to, whether you're talking about primates or other organisms, will allocate time and energy to maximize their fitness. So here you can see the life history trajectory of just a mammal, right? And challenges, which is not that different from primates, except primates have a really slow life histories, and squirrel monkeys in particular for something that's small. And life history in primates is something that's always interested me. So let me just introduce my study species. So squirrel monkeys, Cymericolince, these are, for those of you not familiar with squirrel monkeys specifically, they're really small. They weigh 2 pounds max, and that's an adult male, so we're talking really small. They eat a lot of fruits and insects. My population seems to eat actually more insects than fruit. They live in large social groups, 25, so my groups are 46 and 50 animals respectively. So pretty large, and most of what we don't know about squirrel monkeys is actually related to their social structure and their social behaviors, their social system. They're seasonal breeders, which is going to become relevant in a little bit. So they mate, as you'll see, for 2 months in June and July, which is usually when I'm in Brazil for the North American summer. And that's when breeding season is going on. And like I said, they have a really long juvenile period, which I'll show the trajectory in a second. So just to clarify one point, okay, so some of you may never have heard of the species, Cymericolince. You may be thinking that, okay, in Brazil, so it's going to be Sciurus. So the species was actually renamed or revalidated very recently. So it used to be that this whole area, all of these squirrel monkeys here were all called Cymerius sciurus, and now we know that the northern part is Sciurus, and we actually have a different species in the area to the south, and that's Cymericolince. So it turns out that my study area is right around here, so my species is actually Colince, and they actually have really different social systems, which makes sense now that I know that they're separate species. So I'm going to start off talking about the juveniles first. Then we're gonna have parts 1, 2, 3, and 4 with the trapping. So primate juveniles, as most of you may know, they have the longest juvenile period of any mammal, which has always been a mystery. They grow slowly. They start reproducing fairly late, even squirrel monkeys, which are something very small. And when not so much now, but especially when I started this work, there was very little information on juveniles. We had for primates. There was a lot of information on adults, a lot of information on infants, but that whole middle period was kind of a black box. We didn't really know much about them in the wild. So as you can see, squirrel monkeys have pretty slow trajectory. So you have here little infant, depending on what species you're talking about. They can be weaned as early as 4 months, or they can nurse for up to 18 months. And males don't start reproducing until they're 4 or 5, and females a little early until they're 3 years old. So that's pretty stretched out, especially considering that they are only weigh 2 pounds. So I started off focusing on what could try to explain this, and my focus fell first on juveniles, particularly because this was sort of the unknown area. We didn't really know what was happening with juveniles, but a lot of things were kind of assumed to be true about juveniles. So my focus was on the foraging pressures on juveniles, because there were two hypotheses that use that as an explanation for why the juvenile period might be so long. So the first hypothesis focused on juveniles being at a very high risk of feeding competition with adults. Okay, so the idea was that because juveniles are less dominant, they're smaller, they're less experienced than adults, so adults are basically going to monopolize their food sources, and juveniles really have no choice as to grow slowly. Otherwise, they would starve if they try to grow any faster. So the idea is that this period is a pretty risky phase. Okay, and the other hypothesis also focuses on foraging, and we know that this has been proposed for other mammals and for birds. Is the idea that juveniles, again, they're poor foragers, not necessarily because of competition, but because they just don't know what they're doing yet. They're too small, they're too inexperienced. So I set out to test out these two hypotheses, among other things. I'm just going to focus on these two today. In wild squirrel monkeys, okay, at my field site in Brazil. And so the data that I'm going to show you up until all the juvenile data is based on information from 14 months in the field. So this is my field site. So I work in the Amazon, but a lot of you may be familiar with Manaus. That's actually nowhere near where I work. I am in the easternmost part of the Amazon. So I'm near the city of Belém, for those familiar with it. I'm about a 3-hour bus ride from Belém into the city of Peixe-Boi, which means manatee, because there are a lot of manatees in that river. And my study area consists of pristine forest and also secondary, more disturbed forests, and it's privately owned property, like I was telling Susan earlier. So it's not a protected area. It basically belongs to the villagers that live in that area. Okay, so pros and cons: it's very easy to get permission to work there because it's just permission from the owners, but the area is not protected. So that's just a picture of what the forest looks like in the morning. And so just a little bit of background about the conditions of just the field site itself. So the climate is seasonal, like you may expect. So the rainy season is the first 6 months of the year, and then it gets drier the second 6 months of the year. And this is going to be important later on. There's basically, you can see right here, the driest months are October and November, and there's very little fruit available for the monkeys during that phase. And the way the seasonality for the reproduction of the squirrel monkeys relates to this is that the babies are born around Christmas, New Year's, and so birth and lactation is happening in the wet season. And then mating season, which is June and July, and gestation is all happening in the dry season when there's not a whole lot of food available. Okay, so like I said, I studied two groups. Mainly, I monitored two groups of squirrel monkeys. Just to give you an idea, this is one of the groups. So there's 9 males and 16 females in that group. So a lot more females than males, and this is true in the other group as well. You can see that males are actually easily distinguishable from females just by their body size. They have a different shaped head. Female and males are very easy to distinguish, but it's not so easy to tell individuals apart, which will be coming up later. And there's about 20 juveniles in the group at different ages. So we have 1-year-olds, 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds, and because they're seasonal breeders and they're all born in cohorts, it's very easy to distinguish a 1-year-old from a 2-year-old from a 3-year-old because they're just different sizes and their head shape starts to change. So half of the group is all juveniles, but we really didn't know what was going on as far as their behavior and ecology. So just a little bit more background. This is an assortment of things that they eat as far as fruits. So they eat, this I'm going to show in a second, they eat this medium-sized palm fruit, they eat berries, they eat things that are pretty large to hold, and so they will just sort of eat it when it falls on the ground. The most common fruit in their diet is this fruit, we call it anajá in Brazil. So it's a palm fruit, and they're not eating the nuts. So they're eating the mesocarp, the yellow part. So it occurs in these giant infructescences, which can have up to 2,000 fruit. I did not count them. That's from the literature. But you can see that it accommodates a large number of individuals foraging at once. And this is pretty hard to peel. I can't peel it unless I use my pocket knife, but they just use their teeth and their hands, and they can peel off that outer part. But they love insects, so this is just an example of one of the large types of insects they eat, big grasshoppers, and they eat them they eat them like an ice cream cone when they capture them. So they hold them with the head up. They bite their head off and then eat the insides. And then sometimes they'll take off the wings, and then sometimes they'll eat the legs and everything, the cone part. So they eat large insects. They're also gleaners. They get just small insects from foliage. They also eat things that are embedded. So here you have an adult male holding a wasp's nest. And actually we have a paper coming out about this. So juveniles and adults both can eat embedded resources, as you'll see, but the technique they use to forage for the larvae is they'll approach a wasp nest, and according to my co-author, this is actually a wasp that is very, it stings, the sting is very painful, and that makes sense because I've been stung by them, so it explains that. So when the nest falls to the ground and the wasps have flown away, the monkey will then approach and grab it, and so there are no adult wasps anymore, and they'll eat the larvae from each of those little chambers. So that's one thing that even juveniles can do. They also eat, especially in the dry season, larvae that are embedded in these sort of like dry little pieces of wood on the ground. Okay, so they extract those resources as well. So coming back to this, so the first hypothesis that I was looking at was basically, it makes a series of predictions that basically juveniles are going to get less food than adults, but it's really because of the presence of adults. So just as an example of things that we might expect to see, you might expect that juveniles show very low foraging efficiency compared to adults. So what does that mean? So basically, we can calculate that as the time that they spend actually eating, consuming food, is going to be low compared to all the time that they spend actually procuring and extracting the food. You might expect them to forage in very large parties when there's a lot of adults, and so there's going to be a lot of competition. And finally, if you look at actual food, what I call food steals or aggression over food, you expect the majority of them to be happening between adults and juveniles, with adults winning. So it's not so straightforward to compare those. So we also have to take into account how much juveniles need, right? Because they're smaller. So we have pretty good data from captive squirrel monkeys from the literature, because they were used in biomedical research for a long time. And so I was able to calculate how much the 1, 2, 3-year-olds need, basically compared to an adult female. Okay, so they wouldn't need as much as an adult female, but pretty close. So we can compare. What you're going to see next is where we expect them to be and where they actually are in terms of how much food they're eating or how efficient they are. So the first graph here, so I just labeled for ease the juveniles J1, 2, and 3. So the 1s are the younger ones and the 3s are the older ones. Adult female, adult male. And this is the ratio of how much time they spend eating versus foraging. And what you can see, and this is actually data from the dry season only. So the wet season is pretty similar, but I picked it from the dry season because that's when there's actually less food available for them. And what you can see is that you expect the juveniles to be around where these gray bars are. And none of this is statistically significant, which is why I put no asterisks, but they're really doing much better than what we expect. So I was expecting the juveniles to be way down here somewhere, but they were not. They were actually just as efficient in terms of being able to eat food compared to how much time they spend looking for food. If you look at intake of prey, which I was able to calculate per day, observing that animals forage for insects or arthropods, again, you have the age, sex classes down here. You have how many captures they made per day for different prey, and again, you have the juveniles where you expect them to be and where they actually are. So they're really not falling short. So this was a big surprise to me because a lot of the literature, really based on not very much data, assumed that juveniles were going to be way, way worse foragers than adults, and basically we're going to be at a high risk of starvation. But at least for squirrel monkeys, that proved not to be true. If we looked at the size of their foraging parties, the first thing that you actually see is that this is individuals within a 5-meter radius when they're foraging. They're very scattered out, and when they're foraging for prey. So when they're foraging for fruit, they're likely to be in larger groups to begin with. When they're foraging for prey, they're pretty spread out, and it's kind of every monkey for itself. And what you can see is that there really is no difference between juveniles and adults. The only difference we found was that adult males, as I'll bring up again, the females are dominant to the males in this species. And so the adult males, they tend to stay in the periphery. And so when they're foraging on those clustered resources, usually the females and juveniles will come first, and then the males will kind of keep their distance, and there'll be one male or two males, but they won't come in those big parties. So the only difference that we really found was with the adult males being a little bit more isolated. Looking at food steal. So the first thing I have to say is that these are not percentages. These are actually counts. So over 12 months, this is all the number of food steals that we saw. So what you have here is between adults and juveniles, adults, juvenile directed at juvenile, and juvenile directed at adult. And you can see that most of this is really between juveniles. There was very little attempts by adults to grab food out of juveniles, only 4 instances over 12 months, really. So there was really not a whole lot of evidence that adults were competing with juveniles for food. And so again, this is from 12 months of data, so that's pretty low values. Part of the reason for that is that they spend a lot of time eating this particular palm fruit, and they spread out in space, really. So the adults, here's a female, here's a male, they stay in the infructescences and basically just pick ripe fruit off of there. But there's a lot of fruit on the ground as well. So when it gets ripe, there's like a carpet of fruit basically below the tree, and the juveniles come to the ground to forage. And so they're really separate from the adults in terms of space, and they're really more in contact with each other than with the adults in the group. The other hypothesis, looking at poor foraging skills. So this, like I said, it's being proposed for some other mammals, for birds, and primates can be extractive foragers. And they, like I showed the examples before, they are manipulating prey that's embedded. They are learning how to handle those big grasshoppers. So those are things that may require motor coordination, enough strength related to body size. So the question was, is the juvenile phase really necessary for the acquisition of all these foraging skills? Again, some of the predictions is if you look especially at prey foraging, although I also looked at fruit foraging, juveniles are just going to be less successful than adults. They may focus on smaller food items because they're easier to handle. And measuring, if you were actually going to look at handling times, like for the palm fruit or large insects, for example, you expect juveniles to take a lot longer to process those items. So I thought this had a higher likelihood of being true. But again, what we find is that here, I actually started off looking at infants. So here you have the really young infants and then the juveniles and the adults. And this is captures by attempts for prey. And I should note that these prey were pretty much small prey. So it's not like the adults are eating the large ones and the juveniles are eating the small ones. So the size of the prey was fairly consistent. And what you can see is that they learn pretty early. They're pretty good at capturing prey. There's a big jump from here to here, but there's really no difference between juveniles and adults in terms of ability to capture and consume prey. So that, to me, that was surprising. If you look at prey captured by size, you can see that pretty much small prey was pretty much everybody's main type of prey. Medium prey was consumed too, but if you look at the large prey, like those big grasshoppers, there's really not much different. The infants weren't able to eat that. But if you look at juveniles and adults, there's really not any significant difference. It's not like only the adults are able to capture and process the large prey. And as an example of this, they have kind of specialized techniques, just like the knocking down the wasp nest. So for example, when they eat caterpillars that have hairs, they kind of use their tail as an oven mitt and get the caterpillar, and then they hold the edges and they rub it on their tail basically to remove the hairs, and then they eat it. And this is a 9-month-old that's already doing that. So now it kind of makes sense to me when we look at part of their life history, which I'll get to, but at the time I was really surprised at how quickly they're able to develop these skills. So what it looked like that neither of the hypotheses related to foraging risks in juveniles were really supported, at least for this population of squirrel monkeys. So you can see that, so this is a lot of my earlier work, and subsequently, people that have looked at the similar hypotheses in other primate juveniles, like lemurs or capuchins, have found very similar things, that juveniles are actually not as bad off in their foraging as we used to think that they were. But since neither of these, the question remained, right? So why do they delay reproduction for so long? Okay. So in my 12 months or 14 months, yeah. Oh, sorry. I don't think it was clipped on very well. So in my 12 months in the field, I started to get interested in the adults as well, okay? And you'll see, some of you may know that squirrel monkey males have a really interesting mating system, but I became particularly interested in these males, but there might be reproductive pressures looking from the adult side of things that may explain why males take so long to breed and females take so long to start reproducing. So in many mammals, we know that social factors in adulthood can be playing a role. Reproductive investment can play a role. In a lot of other mammals, we know that older animals, larger animals, and perhaps more dominant animals, especially in females that have better access to food resources, it may pay off to delay reproduction until you're actually able to support those infants or attain higher dominance rank in the group, even for males, okay? So that kind of leads us into the adult males, which to me, the adult male and it's the most interesting part of the story of squirrel monkeys. But so some of you may know this, some of you may not, but so the fatted males are a really weird thing that squirrel monkeys do. So this is a male, the same male, during the birth season or not the breeding season, and there's a male, the same male, during mating season. There's a 2-month breeding season. And the proximity of the lens, I'm not the best photographer, so there's a difference there. But you can see that male, he's all bulked up, okay? So what happens, what was discovered in the 60s is that, and it's called, scientifically, it's called the fatted male phenomenon in squirrel monkeys. Nobody has a more formal name for it. So I think it's a pretty good name anyway, because that's exactly what happened. So the males, for 2 months, they will basically bulk up. It's not muscle mass, it's water retention, some fatty tissue, and they basically start to look like football players. That's the best description of them because they put on weight up here. And we knew from, like I said, the captive data, a little bit about the physiology of this. So it's a hormonally driven process. We've been able to verify in the field, too, that it's not because they're eating more during that time. It has nothing to do with food intake. It's purely a hormonal process. But being an evolutionary biologist, I really wanted to know, why does this happen, right? And we don't know of other species of primates that quite do this in the same way. So what I was wondering was, I immediately thought of sexual selection, right? So why is this adaptive at all, right? So do these fat males have an advantage? So it's not that some males fat and some don't, but all males kind of that are adults fatten to a degree. But some of them really look huge. You wonder how they can move. They look so puffed up. And some of them plump. They don't really get that fat. And it's you can actually distinguish them, like as you'll see, small, medium, large categories. So it's possible that females were choosing these fatter males, right? Females are dominant in the species, so it would be possible that this is some sort of ornament to attract females. Could also be that just looking bigger, looking more intimidating could help them in competing with other males, and even in direct fights. It could be a little bit of both. It could be neither, of course. So after the longer term work with the juveniles, again, I set out to just be there in the breeding season and look at particularly what was going on with their mating. So again, females are dominant to males, and this is pretty important for the rest of the story. And now if you look at aggressive interactions, there was some interesting patterns here. So here we have different kinds of, we have threats, we have chases, we have actual direct one-on-one fights. And first I should say that in the 12-month data, what we saw was that 62% of the male-male aggression was concentrated in the 2-month mating season. So really, most of the aggression was really concentrated between males in those 2 months. There were a lot of fights. So one of the first things we can see here is the white bars is basically interactions between males and females, and it's pretty low, right? So and the few observations here, it's really the females threatening the males. So males will pursue females. If the female is not interested, she'll just walk away. If the male insists, sometimes she'll turn around and try to bite the male. So there's really no coercion of males to females. There's a fair number of aggression between males. And these dark green bars were a kind of a random surprise that we didn't expect. So this is aggression between males and females' youngest juvenile. So when the mating season is starting, like they're just getting weaned. They're at the tail end of weaning. And so if I show anybody this graph, immediately what people think is that, well, the adult males are beating up on the juveniles because they want to mate with their moms. It turns out that it's the exact opposite. The juveniles actually beat up on the adult males. The first time I saw this, I thought this has to be like an anomaly. But consistently, we've been seeing this. And actually, one of my students in Brazil looked at specifically what was going on between the infants and the adults, and we have some data on that. One of the things we found, but we don't have a large enough sample yet, is that the infants seem to harass the males that are less fat more. So we don't know what that means yet, but so that was kind of a surprise. So this is one of our trapped males, which I'll talk about the trapping later, but we also noticed when we trapped them that males were in bad shape. Okay, so this guy is a fairly young guy. We could tell by his dentition, but he was like, his lip is split. He was missing several teeth, and he was one of the males that was always getting into fights during the mating season. He was missing digits, so the situation and a lot of the males were kind of beaten up like that. There were a lot of fights between males, like visually we observed a lot. Sometimes the males would be fighting on a tree, and then they would roll, like fall on the ground and be fighting on the ground. One male lost like a huge part of his upper lip in a fight. So there's definitely aggression between males. If we look at some of the sexual behaviors between males and females, the important thing here is that most of it is initiated by males. Okay, so if anybody has questions on this, I'd be happy to talk about it later. But females, I did not see females soliciting. So females actually walking up to a male, presenting hindquarters or vocalizing. There was really no indication so far that I haven't seen it. But like I said, the females will only pretty much mate with a male that they want, right? If the female is not interested, the male won't coerce her to mate with him. But most of it is actually initiated by the males. So they don't actively solicit copulations. Now, to me, this is the most interesting graph, okay? So we were able to look at who they spend time with, who the males spend time with, according to how fattened they are, basically. So, like I said, the males, grades 1, 2, and 3, think of super fat, medium fat, and little fat. So it's small, medium, large. This is who they spend time with, okay? So they could spend time with other males, females, with juveniles. They could hang out alone. Males hang out alone a lot. And what we found was that if you look at the white bars, which are the least fatted males, they don't spend a whole lot of time with females. We don't, it's pretty difficult to get a big sample on copulations, but they did copulate less. And they spend a lot of time alone, just kind of hanging out. And the females don't seem to like to hang around them as much as they do with the medium and the super fat males, okay? So that was pretty interesting. And it's not because the males are not pursuing, it's basically because the females don't seem to be favoring those males. So I'm actually, after seeing all this, and this was data from about 4 mating seasons, that there's ever any babies born into the group at all, because the females have to be receptive to the males and want to mate with them. There's a lot of aggression among the males. There's these juveniles harassing the males, and it's exactly when the males try to approach their mom to mate with her. But somehow almost every female gets pregnant every year, and we see babies. So somehow somebody's able to mate, but it's not easy for the male. So how does this fattening relate to this whole mystery? Well, one of the possibilities, again, we know a little bit of this from another captive project that I'm involved with in Brazil. If older males are able to be more dominant in the group, which is the case in a lot of primates, they actually have higher testosterone levels. We know that from captivity, the males that fat, their testosterone goes up. They might fatten more and have higher reproductive success. So that's a possibility of something that males are dealing with, male squirrel monkeys particularly. So the idea would be that until they get older and they reach a certain status in the group, like I said, there are males that only plump. The females ignore them, but sometimes the males try to fight with them. So until they can get to a good level of fattening, basically, it may pay off to just hang on and reproduce a little bit later, let's say when you're 5 years old than when you're a 3-year-old, for example, okay? So this is, we don't know this for sure, but from captive work that we're sort of starting to piece this together. So there'll be hopefully a lot more data that I can present later about fatted males, because the mystery still sort of continues. So what about the females? Well, the females actually they have a whole different set of challenges, right? There's no fatting and fighting and that whole situation to go on, but they have really expensive babies. I mean, really expensive. So we know this is a picture these are all pictures that I took. So this is a baby that's about a week old on his mom, and you can see the size of their heads is pretty similar. They have really large heads. They're born with really large heads. And brain growth, as you'll see, it happens extremely slowly, okay? So we know just from female life history that gestation length is very long. It's 5 months. Everything with an asterisk is data that we actually have from the field. So they gestate for 5 months, and they gestate during the dry season. The infant-mom ratio is pretty high. The infants weigh about 16% of the mom's weight when they're born. We're actually able to trap neonates, and they're pretty large compared to the size of the female. Now, from the literature, there's some really interesting data that show that when they're born, 96% of their brain is already complete. So they're born with their brain almost all formed, and the other 4% basically takes place during the first 2 months of life. So they're born with large brains, they grow their brains pretty quickly when they're infants, and now it kind of makes sense to me why they might develop the foraging skills so fast, is because their brain is so well developed. And in this species, the infants nurse for about 8 months. So the females are not carrying them for 8 months, but they're nursing them for 8 months, carrying them for about 4 or 5 months. So that's pretty expensive for the females. And the interbirth interval is actually 1 year. So I've seen females basically wean infants, and then they mate that mating season, and then they're pregnant again. Okay, so not every female gets pregnant every single year, but a lot of the females, they go from one infant to another. Okay. Some of the data that we just, newer data from my grad student show that if you look, she looked at foraging, feeding diet of females compared to males during different parts of the breeding season. And one interesting thing was that we found that, she found that pretty much in all seasons, whether they're mating or gestating or lactating, the females focus on insects a lot more than males do. Okay, so they spend more time eating bugs, basically. This is just an activity budget graph from when they're gestating. So what we thought was that basically when the females are lactating, it's going to be really expensive for them. But it turns out that even when they're pregnant, they spend a lot of time foraging. They don't spend a lot of time resting compared to the males. And this is during the period of the lowest fruit availability. So if everybody was starving, you really wouldn't expect differences between males and females. But we see that females seem to have it worse and seem to spend more time looking for food. So again, this is when food availability is low. So for the females, you might have something playing out where we know this is true for a lot of mammals. Body weight increases fecundity. So if the females are able to get bigger, maybe get more dominant, there must be a hierarchy within the females. If they're able to support these expensive neonates, I don't think like a 2-year-old female necessarily could do that. But maybe that's why they delay reproduction, because if they try to do it too soon, they're just not ready for it, right? They're just not physically ready. So there's a lot of open questions, as you'll see. There's probably a lot of questions you're going to ask me at the end, and the answer is going to be, we don't know yet, we don't know yet, we don't know yet. So we know that, again, the females are dominant over the males. We don't know how the hierarchy is working within the females. I believe there is one, but I don't have systematic data on them. And the males. We do know that the males move from group to group during mating season. So they'll be part of group A, but then they'll go to group B for a little bit, try to mate with the females there, and then they'll be back to group A. They'll just spend like a week there and then come back. So, and there must be some hierarchy, I assume, among males. But as you can see, there's 50 animals in a group, right? 40 to 50 animals. So it's really difficult to get really specific social data without being able to tell them apart, right? How are you going to tell which animal is dominant, which animal is subordinate? And there's, because of this, for pretty much all squirrel monkey species, there's a big open area of a gap, so to speak, where we don't know a lot of what's going on socially. So I think that's kind of where the future for work with squirrel monkeys is sort of going to go. So with marking them, that brings me to the end, or the last part, which is kind of the most fun part, is how to trap a squirrel monkey. So I'll tell you, what I'm going to show you is what worked. There was a lot of things that did not work. But so initially, my thought was, this was like 2011, 2012. I was still focused on the squirrel monkey males. So my initial idea was, well, I just want to capture the males. I need to capture the males because we need to put collars on them so we can see who's getting more copulations, really quantify fattening, right? So instead of small, medium, large, we can actually weigh them and see who's actually fatter, who's actually heavier. And while we have them, we can get some blood if we trap infants, and really maybe do paternity and see whether fatter males are actually having more offspring, which would be like the ultimate way to really tell whether that's an adaptation or not. So that's kind of how the trapping idea started. Well, in field work, you start with plan A and suddenly you're like at plan C or D, right? So again, what I'm going to show you for the trapping is what works. We had many iterations of things that didn't work. I'll be glad to talk about that if somebody is interested about what didn't work. So this is one of the things that didn't work. So I'll just put one of them up. So we try to trap them in, we try to use methods that other people had used, like for capuchins. The idea was that we'd put bananas in here, and this was a large enough cage, basically, and maybe like, I don't know, 5, 6 monkeys would go in, and then there's a hideout, and then we would basically like pull the door shut, and then we would trap like 6 animals at once, for example. Well, that was not what happened. We were actually only able to get 3 animals at once, and once they were extremely reluctant to go into this. First of all, they wouldn't go in the wet season because it was probably just too much food. We found out that the optimal time to attract the monkeys to the bananas was November. So we don't even bother trying to trap in July and August anymore. It has to be November. So that didn't work. So me and then some colleagues in Brazil who really had, I really give them credit for this idea, we had to trap in the dry season. We had to really have, if we had like a giant cage, like an even bigger one, something that they would feel comfortable going in, and something that we could actually get a lot of animals at once, because once the group saw the rest of the group go in, they're out of there. Like they would take a really long time to basically trust that whole trapping structure again. So this is what we ended up with. So, and this seemed like a really crazy idea, and I had some funding that year that I was in Brazil for the whole year, 2013, and I thought, I'm not going to invest any money and time on this because this is not going to work. But my colleague in Brazil, the vet, he said, is anything else working? What do you have to lose? And I said, okay, fine, let's do it, and it was actually worked really well. So first, we would identify an area where the monkeys in the home range, where there were trees, doesn't have to be palm trees, but just trees in a circular, more or less circular configuration. We'll build a pretty large platform in the middle, and put ropes, okay? So I'm showing you that there's no branches or anything. So the idea was that in the beginning, the monkeys could get to the platform just by regular branches and just regular routes. Eventually, we also put the ropes in the beginning so they would be familiar with it. Eventually, we cut out any access area. So to get to the platforms, this was like over like a month or two, they had to use the rope. So we had bananas in there, and the monkeys started coming. And they didn't actually take that long because it was like September, so they were starting to get hungry. And gradually, like I said, we eliminated any other connections from the trees to the platform. So they had to use the ropes to get to the food. But we put the ropes there in the beginning, obviously, because we didn't want them to show up one day and be, what's this strange thing that showed up? So the ropes were there from the beginning. We also had this, I'm very proud of this. This was our tower of observation. So this was from a distance, and you could actually see down to the platform. So you could see who was there, like how many monkeys at the same time, and you could just get a really good window. And I should note that through some elaborate system that I would never be able to replicate if I were to do this alone, my colleague built there was a pulley system, and basically there was a way that the person in the hideout could control the ropes would fall down. Okay, so basically we had that, and then we put a net around, and they were not freaked out by the net at all. Now this net was just like a fishing net, so it was about 3 meters high. It's soft, so it's kind of wobbly, so it wasn't like hard plastic or anything. And as you'll see in the photos, it's very transparent. The net was white, and we had to dye it green, which was a whole nother adventure in a cauldron and like dyeing it green. But so we wanted it green so it would blend into the vegetation. And then we eliminated some ropes that they weren't using very much. And then on this is after, I don't know, 3 months when they're really, really getting hungry, they're really coming in. So then on the trapping day, somebody would be at the hideout, and when there were enough monkeys inside, we would pull the rope, and the monkeys were trapped. Now, this is the part that I didn't think was going to work. There's no cover over here, right? So you're probably thinking, well, why don't they just go up the net and they're out of there, right? How are they really trapped? It turns out that they don't. And that was the part that I really had to see it to believe it. What they do is they basically they come to the ground and they keep trying to go through the net. It's like they don't see it as a physical barrier. I suspect because they can actually see what's on the other side. And they just keep balling up into the net, and by that point, the person that pulled the ropes down already radioed us in, and so we would come in and get the monkeys. We would go in and physically get each monkey and anesthetize it. So this is what you can see. The net is like very transparent, okay, almost transparent. There's the platform with some bananas. There's our hideout. It was really fun to be in there. And I have a little video of this, so hopefully now it's a montage of different days, so you can see different phases of the trapping. It starts out really dark because we used to put the bananas out very early in the morning, like just at like 5 in the morning, so the monkeys would still be dark when they got there. But you can kind of see what's going on, I think. So that's why it's dark. There are the ropes. And there's the monkeys. So you can kind of see them coming down. They're like little ants. And I also promised that no monkeys were hurt by the trapping. We even trapped babies, and they were fine. What happened? So they're all kind of on the ground there. And there come the humans. There you can see better. I think that eventually they might have figured out how to go up it, but we were there by the time we got there. Okay. So that was it seems really simple now that it worked, but took a long time. So it did work. We did get animals. There's a adult male with a radio collar. So we were able to put collars on. We got about 25, we got about half of one social group, which was good. And then the next year we did it and we got some of the other social group. So we just had our makeshift lab in the forest. So, these are some of the collars that I put on them. This was the cheapest part. This is the cheapest part of my research. It's very low key. I make these myself. I just get the beads at what's the name? Is Michael's, and just make the collars. Juveniles couldn't be collared, right? Because they're still growing. So after much experimenting and talking to other primatologists, I figured that this was a really good hair dye that would work at least temporarily to mark the juveniles. At least it would last for at least the trapping season. And then they all got microchips anyway. And this was tested on my cats, and it worked really well and did not harm them. So here is a female, here's a male. Now, the only thing is that because trapping has to be in November, I will never trap a fatted male because they're fatted in June and July, and they will not go into the trap then. So what we ended up trapping was a lot of females, interestingly enough. Most of the individuals who trapped were females. They were in the last month of gestation. So we were very careful with the anesthesia, and also never to drop a rope if there was a pregnant female on the rope, obviously. Like, they had to all be on the table. But then we trapped them later with their babies, and everybody was fine. So here's another juvenile. So we were able to get blood and do all kinds of measurements. And so it really, the initial idea was to get these males. That was my motivation. And it ended up, we got a lot of females, and we got some males eventually. And now we really have at least one more tool to try to look at some of these broader questions. I don't know, we don't know yet who is it that disperses from the group? Where do they go? The asterisk is something that we have preliminary data on that. It actually is starting to look like both males and females disperse from the group. But that's preliminary. Like, we need more of the genetic data. Who's related to whom? Are the females related? Are they sisters? Is there some sort of relatedness that's high with the females in the group? The dominance hierarchies, if we have them marked, we can start to see, okay, well, the yellow female is hanging out with this female, or we can establish who's fighting more. And this was really interesting. I hadn't thought of this, but we ended up actually using it for this. How do they engage in allocare? And it turns out that they do, because now that we have females marked, we were able to see that females that did not get pregnant that season, nonetheless, they were carrying infants months later, and obviously it wasn't their infant. And they seem to, at least, we don't know if they exchange infants, the females that have infants, but we know that females that didn't have infants will help care for other infants. So, so a lot of sort of new possibilities opened. But I'm a little sad that I don't get to hold a fatted male. But all right, so I just wanted to finish by acknowledging everybody, all the people that gave me money to do the research, in addition to also all the assistants that helped. And I will be happy to take any questions that you guys may have. Yes.
A couple questions about the males. Now that you have marked males, you can see whether they fatten persistently over years. Is that something that you think is happening?
That's a really good question. We don't know. That's a little bit hard. It's hard to answer because the males, they stay in the periphery, right? They come into the group when they're fatter, when they're gonna mate. But like I said, they spend times like moving from group to group during the mating season. So sometimes we lose track of the males. But that's a really interesting question, is to see if it's like the same males that are able to fatten over.
And then related to that, you said it's hormonal. Can you induce fattening? So can you inject them with whatever hormone?
You might be able to do that in captivity. I don't know that anybody has actually done it. We don't actually know, even from captivity, if it's some cue from the females, because what we know is that even males that are not housed with females, they will fatten. But we don't know if they can hear the females and next door, or if it's something related to the season or what. Yeah.
You kind of already answered this, but I was wondering so you mentioned that males will visit other groups during the mating season, but do you also see sometimes immigrants from other places during regular season when they're not mating? So when the fatting, when they're fat, is that the only time they actually
I don't know.
fight?
I don't know. It's possible that they do at other times, but it's hard to tell because when they go to the other group, they basically if it was in the non-mating season, they're not going to be in the center of the group anyway. So I've only seen it in the breeding season. Doesn't mean that it doesn't happen, but I don't know. Yeah.
So Barry Bowman has this hypothesis regarding human patterns of maturation, and he argues that the adolescent male growth spurt in humans is selected for by violent male-male competition. That the juvenile phase is not dangerous; it's the liminal intermediary phase that is, and so human females are on a relatively steady growth trajectory through adolescence, and males delay and then accelerate basically as the females. So in your sort of possible explanatory slide with regard to male patterns of maturation, you emphasized, if I recall correctly, fattening. But given the level of damage that males seem to be incurring through agonistic conflict, it's at least conceivable that it's not just fattening, that fattening is probably some intersexually selected signal in some fashion, and that direct agonistic conflict is a separate intrasexually selected feature of their growth trajectory where and if the way that one would test that would be to see whether in addition to the overarching prolonged juvenile period, you have differences in growth rates where you would expect males to be growing. If female-female conflict is less violent than male-male conflict, then you would expect males to be growing more rapidly during the phase where they are reaching adulthood compared to females.
Yeah, that's actually data that we have from captivity. That there's a primate center that's very near the field site, and they have a huge population of squirrel monkeys, and they have growth data for a lot that just nobody has done anything with it. But that's a really interesting idea. Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks. So another aspect of life history, of course, is mortality rates. And so is there any information about age-specific mortality? And it just...
I do know that an adult male that had a collar died. But we only because we found the collar. But we know that from other populations of squirrel monkeys. I'm sorry, I don't know if you finished your question.
Oh, just because it seems like they'd be very vulnerable to predation. And so my next question was going to be if the large groups, if there are alarm calls, and if the social organization itself is an effective defense against.
Yeah, so there was a whole nother experiment that I did, a field experiment that I didn't show today. But basically, the juveniles seem to be, they're more cautious in terms of going to areas that are potentially, they're vulnerable to predators. We do know that, at least from other species of squirrel monkey, the mortality for the infants is really high when they're on the mom's backs. And one of the things that we see that is interesting is that not only are they seasonal breeders, but the females, they'll give birth really close to each other. So one year we had 15 females pregnant, 12 of them gave birth in one night. Same night. We came back the next day, there were 12 infants, and then the other 3 shortly after. And in Costa Rica, they seem to do the same thing. They give birth really very synchronized. And that could be, it's being argued that that could be just like a dilution effect for the predation or more eyes and ears, yeah. And they do give, they have separate alarm calls for aerial predators, and then they have them for things like snakes as well, yeah.
So do the new moms cluster together spatially more when they have a baby than during other times?
Yeah. Yeah, they do, yeah. And we actually haven't gone back and looked at the data, but because we have some females marked, what we haven't looked at yet is, are there certain females that are clustering together, right? It's just a matter of looking at our data set, we haven't gotten there yet, but yeah.
I have a question about those eating and foraging ratios. I was wondering, the denominators, do they actually spend about the same amount of time foraging? So, like they
Oh.
same in efficiency, but the amount that they spend.
Yeah, because when you look at activity budgets, it's, which I didn't show, it's also, there's no significant difference, yeah. Yeah, just.
What about the adult male versus female size when they're not fatted? Is there much of a sexual dimorphism or?
It's, I think it's about, I can't remember, it's about 30%, maybe a little bit less.
So even when they're not fatted?
Even when they're not fatted. You can tell, I mean, there are other things that distinguish the males, but they are a little bigger than females. From the trapping data, I wanna say that it is something like 30%, but yeah, they're bigger than the females, yeah.
At the beginning, you mentioned that they had different social organization from Sciurius. How do they differ?
So in Sciurius, and this puzzled me for a long time. So in Sciurius, the males are dominant, and there's apparently a dominant, among the males, there's a dominant male, and so it's more like what we expect for, most of sort of mixed male, mixed female groups, where the males have most of the power basically in the group. And when I started working with these guys, everybody thought they were still Sciurius. So I went into the field expecting to see that, and I wasn't seeing that. I kept thinking they're doing something strange here because they're the same species and the females are dominant. And it turns out that the people at the primate center who also have Colincy, they knew for decades that they can't even house. If they house a male and like 2 or 3 females, the females will beat up the male, which doesn't seem to be the case in Sciurius, so, yeah.
I wonder how that happened.
Yeah,
And it just separated by the river.
yeah, Jessica knows more about that.
They're not actually even the most closely related species
Yeah,
to
that's
each
the
other.
interesting
So they're
thing.
both coming to the river from
Yeah.
different
Oh,
means and then just stuck there,
So
Yeah.
separated.
that wasn't the divergence point.
No.
No, yeah. It's interesting because Boliviensis, which is all the way in western Amazon, they are also female dominated.
Okay.
So, yeah. Yeah.
Did you say there was a lot of variation in the age of weaning?
Yes.
So what is
Yeah. Between
hypotheses?
species.
Yeah, hypotheses to account for that.
I don't know that anybody really has, like done a comparative analysis looking at what the factors can be. But I know that in Boliviensis, in the Peruvian side, they nurse for 18 months, and the interbirth interval is about 2 years. It's not 1 year. Why there's that variation, we don't know. That's something that's always puzzled me. Yeah, because they can be, in Costa Rica, they're basically weaned at like 4 months. And for my population, it's 8 months, so, yeah, I don't know.
So what proportion of them has an interbirth interval of 1 year versus 2 years? Do you know yet without the individual recognition?
I would say that the majority is 1 year, yeah.
Because that's kind of awkward that they have a gestation of 5 months and then a weaning time of 8 months, but tight seasonality. It seems like they could easily get knocked out of the running. You see what I mean? We
Yeah.
have that issue in capuchins. We have a 23-month
Yeah.
birth interval. And
Yeah. Some of them wean a little, you think they're weaned at like 6 months, and then you'll see suddenly like the infant is nursing on her. whether there's milk coming, I mean, it could
Or is
just,
that out
yeah.
Do you know for sure?
Well, no, we know that it's her, if we know that it's her infant, yeah, yeah. I don't know if there's allo nursing, I've only seen the other females carry the babies, I don't know if they do, I don't know if they do the allo nursing. Yeah, that's, I suspect that yes, but not sure, yeah.
Is there anything known about infanticide in the different species of?
We've never, that's not been reported for squirrel monkeys. And I definitely, like, the females won't even allow the males to go anywhere, and the males won't even try, yeah.
You mentioned that the infant mortality was relatively high, but that's because of intrinsic factors, not because
No, well,
of predation?
In Costa Rica, I know that mortality was high due to predation by birds.
Because they're on the back.
Yeah, they just pluck them off,
Okay.
yeah. I saw a few attempts at that, I didn't see any success, I didn't see like a successful event. Like I didn't see females, like they had marks on their back or anything like that. But there were, I mean, anecdotally, I can tell you that there were more alarm calls and there were more predators around, like when they were infants, yeah.
Because it's somewhat unusual to have the infant on your back, but just the whole body shape of and movement patterns of squirrel monkeys, they can't, they don't even come to the front to nurse, they just tuck under the arm.
Yeah, yeah, I have a really great picture of a female with a tiny baby on her back, and if you've ever observed squirrel monkeys in the wild, I mean, they jump huge distances, huge gaps, and you think she's gonna fall, but the baby continues to sleep on her back and she gets to the other side, so, yeah.
So do you have any sense of juvenile mortality or adult mortality?
No. Like I said, I only know that one male died, but that's because we had a collar on him and we found the collar. But we don't even know how long they live in the wild. Yeah, we have like estimates for captivity, but in the wild, like we just don't have the long-term, yeah.
For the female dominance, is it because the females are forming coalitions against the males, or is it single females that are able to?
Actually, single females are, at least during the mating season, it's interesting because during the mating season, a single female will just send a male away. At other times, I'm sure I know the females cluster together, they may be forming coalitions. The males don't even seem to try. They just stay away from the females. But I have seen like several females, like the males will start approaching and the females will start threatening them. Like especially at fruit trees, yeah.
So capuchins have all of these elaborate gestures for doing coalitions, but you don't see any of that, the head flags or the stacking? Or
Squirrel monkeys, for all that they live in these large groups, they're very antisocial. They don't even groom. They don't groom. I've never seen grooming. I saw twice a female grooming her infant. Just a little bit like on the head. But the best measure really of friendship or whatever would really be proximity, because they don't sit and groom the other, they don't even groom themselves. And I think that there's a lot on the vocalization that they're probably, the whole vocal grooming hypothesis, like they might be keeping in contact that way, especially because they spread out over such a large part of the forest when they don't fission, but they just kind of form this thin layer. But they're able to they're constantly talking to each other. Yeah.
That's my experience with Sayurias too. Is anyone working on, beyond that very early work done in Germany of what they're saying?
No. I don't think anybody's even working with that in captivity as far as I know.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're constantly talking.
Yeah, I mean, I've just been able to tell, generally, like there's contact calls, there's long range calls, but who is making the calls is really almost impossible to tell. Even if you had them marked, I think it would be really, because they're hiding in foliage and
It sounds
there's.
like gossip.
Yeah, it does. They're constantly, it's very difficult to walk under a group of squirrel monkeys. You'll find them. They're easy to find. They're not easy to follow, but they're easy to find because they're so noisy.
So what are their ectoparasite loads like if they don't groom? Or do they groom themselves constantly or what?
No, but when we trap them, most of them, not the juveniles, but most of the adults had ticks. Yeah, most of the adults, it's like around, especially like their legs and they're around their ears, but not the juveniles.
Well, you'd think they could remove their own ticks from ears and legs. It's kind of strange.
Yeah, I mean, they just kind of scratch, but they don't, it's not the same, the traditional grooming where they just, no. They're always looking for food.
They play though.
They
right?
play.
Other temple play. So the adults do that too, or just?
No, just the juveniles. The juveniles do that a lot, and they will, that's something, another collaboration that I'm working on. They use the ground a ton. They come to the ground, they will, especially in the dry season where they're looking for bugs, there are these, so there's a lot of dry leaves and there are these brown cricket type things. And they will just stay there for hours and just, well, maybe not hours, but a long time and like go through the foliage. And the juveniles play on the ground, they roll around. I mean, they play on trees too, but they spend way more time on the ground than I expected.
Yeah, fishes do that too.
Yeah.
When they grab the wasp nests, and you say they knock them to the ground, do they do that with a hand, or do they whack it with the tail to avoid getting stung?
They just do it with their hand. It's so quick. They just kind of run into it and do that. And then these nests are fairly small.
Is it Felistes?
Oh, I have to look at it might be. I have to look at the paper that I'm doing with the wasp guy. Like, he was able to identify it. But it might, that sounds familiar.
Yeah.
It hurts. And I've seen infants try to do that and or try to at least like approach the nest and they got stung. So that the juveniles can do it, but like a 4 or 5 month old infant, like they'll just get stung.
Mm-hmm.
But they don't eat ants, Noah.
Questions? Thank you.